Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us today to discuss the prospects for the South Asia region. The region entered 2026 on a robust footing, strong growth, low or below target inflation. It had some runway to engineer a soft landing in the event of an external shock. But now that runway is beginning to run out with the pressures in global energy markets. So let me turn to our guest, Indermit Gill, the World Bank Group Chief Economist. Indermit, what are the repercussions of the conflict in the Middle East for our client countries, for emerging markets and developing economies?
So the repercussions are not good. I don't think that anything good is coming out of this conflict. For the global economy as a whole, as you said, at the beginning of the year, we thought that we would actually upgrade our expectations of growth. So global growth was expected to be about 3% this year. We're now down to about 2.5, 2.4%. And this is across the board. This is for advanced economies. This is also for emerging markets and developing countries. To be sure, actually, South Asia is one of the strong points. South Asia, especially India, is expected to continue to grow at above 6%, which is fantastic, by the way. So I know that compared to last year, things don't look good this year in South Asia, but compared to other parts of the world, things look good in South Asia.
It's good to hear that South Asia kind of fits the broader pattern, doing well,
It does.
but now really being put under pressure. Now we're beginning to see the pressure in some areas with the energy imports, but there is a time bomb waiting with the fertilizer imports. In South Asia, India, for example, imports about 85% of the materials it needs to create fertilizer.
Right.
For now, most countries in the region have stocks for this particular sowing season that's starting kind of nowish. It's the next season.
Yeah.
If this conflict doesn't end, then the next season there will be shortages in the next sowing season.
So I wanted to ask you about what's going on in South Asia too, because when you look at the numbers, things don't look that bad, actually. But when you hear the stories, you hear lots of issues about long lines for natural gas and shortages of fuel, huge increases in fertilizer prices and so on. Yeah. So what's going on in South Asia? Actually, tell me.
It's very true. You have the pressures are currently hitting the most vulnerable. So, for example, in Nepal, cooking gas cylinders are only half full because people are trying to stretch it. We have long lines at gas stations in Bangladesh. Bangladesh may well be the country most under pressure right now. In India, the restaurants have stopped some types of cooking, like deep frying things. No? So you see the pressures in the vulnerable populations and the small and medium-sized firms that don't really have the buffers. So countrywide, things still look okay. But vulnerable populations are already beginning to feel the pressure. And if this lasts and really translated into first fertilizer shortages and then maybe eventually food shortages, then we will really see big impacts. We'll see bigger impacts.
So India is a microcosm of the world in that sense. So I mean, essentially what we are seeing as the prices for fuels, for fertilizers, and for food get affected, it'll be the poor who will be affected the most. Exactly. So while currently it's actually the relatively wealthy off who aren't doing well, very quickly all of these effects are going to start to hurt the poor. And by that I mean not just poor people within a particular country, but also poor people within the world. So in a sense that the next effect from South Asia and East Asia, next region of the world, which we think is going to be affected a lot, is actually Africa, both because of higher food prices, but also because of fragility, because of conflict and other, there is a lot of food insecurity in many countries there already. So to the extent that Asian agriculture, or South Asian agriculture doesn't do well, it will have rebound effects on them too, through exports of rice, etc. Yeah.
This is exactly the pattern we're also seeing in the region. So those who had buffers, they're kind of okay for now with vulnerable groups being affected. But the ones who are already struggling, like, for example, Bangladesh already had above target inflation, is struggling much more to digest this shock now and try to engineer a softish adjustment.
Yeah.
But the critical moment will really come in autumn, when the next sowing season starts. If the fertilizers are not available then, it'll be a really difficult 12 months ahead of us. And that's not even counting for El Nino, which is supposed to be a strong one at the moment.
So I hear from the cropping seasons in the West, especially North America and Asia and others, you already are seeing less fertilizer being applied, less land under cultivation and so on. One can actually expect that the output, food output and so on, is going to be lower. On the other side, I hear that at least in South Asia as well as other parts of Asia, we're expecting a good crop. Am I right?
Yes, that's right. This particular crop will be okay. It's good enough. I mean, in fact, the outlook is positive. It's the next crop that's really the risk. And for example, in Bangladesh, with the gas shortages, the 4 of the 6 fertilizer plants, state-owned companies that are producing it, have already had to shut down.
I see.
So it's really the next planting season. It's September, October that will be absolutely critical for prospects for the next year.
So our poverty projections, by the way, for the global economy as a whole, our poverty projections indicate that if you just look only at GDP growth rates and so on across the world, poverty kind of continues to decline.
Yeah.
Okay. However, if once you add in the price effects, you find that depending on the price of fuels, especially cooking fuels, food, fertilizers, and so on, you actually find a huge increase in poverty.
Yeah, that makes sense. Not just increase in poverty, loss of jobs too. And there, let me just give you the sort of statistics on the jobs agenda for South Asia. So over the next decade, about 280 million people will come of age in South Asia. So the equivalent number for the world is 1.2 billion. Of these 1.2 billion, 280 million are in South Asia.
So about a quarter.
Yes, about a quarter. So any growth setback, especially this type of growth setback that may turn out to be very severe, is going to reduce the number of jobs available to all these people when the region was already struggling to create enough jobs and enough good jobs. So for example, the average labor productivity in South Asia is somewhere between a quarter and a third of the average emerging market and developing economy. I'm not even comparing to advanced economies.
Yes.
It's very low. These are bad jobs, mostly. 90% of jobs are informal. So the temptation, of course, for the authorities is then to become very prescriptive, to try and deploy very targeted tools to fix the jobs problem. And South Asia has experimented with a lot of industrial policies. It's used about twice as many measures since 2019 as the average emerging market and developing economy. Now, it's done that because the record for other countries has often been one of success. So, for example, your latest PRR on industrial policy for development shows that industrial parks, for example, they have worked in Vietnam, in China, in Turkey, in Poland. But in our regions, the record has been kind of mixed.
Okay, so actually, I want to say 2 quick things. First, about the jobs part, about the quantity and the quality of jobs. You're right that one can actually use industrial policy and so on. But I think one of the things that policymakers in South Asia need to know is that when you have a lot of uncertainty, policy uncertainty, you will get less investment, you will get less hiring. And the kind of hiring that you'll get is going to be relatively low quality in the sense of shorter-term jobs and so on. So I know that because you are now going to be chief economist not just for South Asia, but also East Asia and the Pacific. And you saw that the economic update for East Asia actually has some numbers on this one, you know. So I think South Asia should expect the same thing. So then you say, okay, what does one do about it? One has to maintain a growth momentum. And to maintain a growth momentum, one needs to maintain a reform momentum. And there's a huge reform agenda in terms of openness, in terms of making things better for businesses, in terms of bringing women both into the labor force and also getting them access into the higher paid occupations, managerial, technical, and so on. So there's all of that already there. Now, on top of that, if one wants to do industrial policy, you're right. You're right, the fact that you do find certain types of industrial policy, like industrial parks, like special economic zones and so on, they have met with some success. But by the way, China has something like 2,500 SEZs. It's not the case that all of them have been successful.
Right.
So actually, when you talk to the Chinese, you actually find there are lots of failure there too.
Right.
So just because they're doing it doesn't mean that it's successful every time. So one has to look more closely and see what are the conditions under which these things are successful. I know, for example, that India does quite a bit of that. India has about 400 SEZs. I'm sure that some of them are successful. I'm sure many are not. So one has to be careful. I think one of the issues that we found with our other report, the one that you mentioned, which is on industrial policy in the 21st century, one of the things that we are finding is that people are thinking that it's an encouragement for countries to do more industrial policy. The story is more complicated. Basically what we are saying, do less industrial policy, do it better.
Thank you, and this is exactly the example we see in South Asia too. So for example, in Tamil Nadu, there has been a very successful industrial park that has brought in electronics manufacturers, including iPhone manufacturers.
Yes.
Then you have the example of Bangladesh, where industrial parks had to be cancelled because the infrastructure couldn't be put in place quickly enough. So it really depends on, it almost depends more how it's done than what is done.
How it's done and what it's done for, right? I know, for example, in the case of Bangladesh, it has been done in part to actually increase exports. Mm-hmm. Generally speaking, we find it's more likely to succeed then because you have a natural test. Because if a country can't export, can't bring it to foreign markets, you know that policy is not working. But when it becomes import substitution, you don't have that test anymore. So I think it's good that many South Asian countries, according to your report, have been shifting away from import substitution towards export promotion, which is fine. That I think is a necessary condition for success. It's not sufficient because you have to sort of get this right too, right? There are lots of things you can do which are wrong, right? So in that sense, I think I don't think the big message for South Asia would be do more industrial policies, because already as compared to the average emerging market, the typical South Asian economy is doing twice as much or has instituted twice as many new industrial policies over the last 4 years. So that's not the trend you want to continue. What you really want to do is take a quick look or take a serious look at these and say, where is it succeeding? Why is it succeeding? Should I do less of some other one and do more of these? Those are the kind of questions that report and so as well as chapter 2 in this report, actually, that's what we're trying to do with these things.
Yeah. Yep. Thank you very much also for linking it to policy uncertainty. So, because policy uncertainty is coming from outside, but it's also coming from inside.
Yes.
A lot of on the fiscal side, especially when fiscal pressures mount, there is a lot of ad hoc policy making in the countries that are under fiscal pressure. So maybe not India, where it's a very deliberative process, but in the others where there are very severe pressures, policies can change very quickly, maybe not exactly retroactively, but sort of very quickly. And then people have to adjust, firms have to adjust. That kind of thing makes it hard to invest.
Yes, but the other thing we find is that when you compare big economies, you compare India with Brazil and Russia and Mexico, as well as the US and China and others, you actually find that India is approaching a period in which its development potential is really never going to be better than over the next 2 decades. So in that sense, I think it's good that India is growing at 6.5, 6% and so on. But the real question would be, how do you increase potential growth up even more than that? So you're growing more like 7, 8, even 9% occasionally when the external environment allows it. Because those are the kind of growth rates that China was growing at back in the early 2000s. And I think that was when China was reaching peak potential. So I think India should be asking, as well as the other countries, as well as Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and all, they should be asking this question, because relatively speaking, the demographic factors are good. Relatively speaking, on the private sector side, the debt factor is also good, right?
Yeah. The market is big, it's an attractive market, so it can be done, but it has to be done, I guess, in a way that doesn't bring these external vulnerabilities, that you then get stop and go kind of growth.
Yes.
big booms and big busts. And that has been India's strength. It's kind of sort of chugged along at 6-7% over decades.
Yes.
Over decades. No, it didn't have these big crises for 3 decades now. It hasn't had these big booms and big busts that then set everything back for a long time. It's lasting scarring. It's done this very, very nicely, chugging along. But if it can step up
Yes.
the pace at which it can chug along, it would be good news for global development.
So even to maintain these growth rates, I think India would have to accelerate the reforms because
Yes.
over time, I mean, of course, the growth rates are going to come down. So if one can offset those with an accelerated pace of reforms, domestic reforms, I know that India, especially India, still needs to be much more open to trade, to FDI. And I think so. Those are the kind of reform. Now, the other thing is there is a tendency to sort of blame protectionism in advanced economies as something of a drag on these things. But it's not just protectionism vis-a-vis advanced economies. It's also the trade with respect to other middle-income countries. There's a huge upside potential there. Yeah.
Thank you for mentioning this, because that is one of the reform agendas that is really taking off now. So it's India, it's Sri Lanka, it's others too. Huh? India has now agreed this EU and UK trade agreements. It's got some with New Zealand, with some of the Gulf countries. It's completely re-energized that agenda, and for the right reasons. And we've actually estimated this is a pro-household reform. It generates obvious gains, real income gains for households. And the even more inspiring example is actually Sri Lanka. It has all these import duties, ad hoc import duties. On average, the import duty is 19%. You cut this, or what they're thinking of cutting now, the 2 of these para-tariffs, would bring that down by 9 percentage points. And the biggest decline would be on processed food and beverages. Guess who consumes the largest share of the consumption baskets of processed food and beverages? It's the poorest quintile of households. This is a pro-poor reform. So this is the opportunity for the region. I think South Asia is beginning to open in this year, next year, and the next few years. It's truly an exciting opportunity for the region.
I want to come back to the question of industrial policy because I know that, you've written about industrial policy in this report. We've written that policy research report. And again, there's this danger that people start to sort of see this as an open season for industrial policy. And it's not, actually. Once again, I think it's very important first to realize that all of the experience in that report actually indicates that industrial policy appears to succeed if at the same time some of these other conditions
Yes.
are being put in place, like, for example, macro stability, low inflation, low fiscal deficits. The second part is greater policy certainty, right, in
Yes.
terms of business regulations and things like that. And then the third thing is, of course, investment in education, health, infrastructure, and things like that. Now, you have to have that. Now, once you have those 3 things, then you say, okay, what should I do? Now, in some cases, what you find is that there are some things that governments have not been able to provide for everybody. But they deem some activities to be especially strategic, especially timely. It's fine to think about industrial policy and say,
Yes.
let's provide those missing public inputs. So those public inputs, we sort of say, look for those first, because that actually is an invitation to governments to look at themselves in a mirror and say, what is it that we should have been providing that we haven't? Okay, so the first thing is to do that. The second thing is to sort of say, do we still need market incentives? Is the market not moving quickly enough in some cases and so on? Can we speed these things along? I know that in the report that you also sort of look at these AI-related technologies,
Yes.
how to adjust to those things, and you look also at regional differences, how to sort of take advantage of huge regional disparities in order to grow quicker and so on. One can think about those things. Then there's a last part. The last part is to sort of start to toy around with exchange rates or start to toy around with
Yeah.
economy-wide R&D.
Yeah.
Those we say one should not consider. In general, one should not consider those, even though countries do those things. If one looks at industrial policy in that context, so essentially what we say is it should be in your toolkit, but it doesn't mean that you use the tools all the time.
Exactly.
There are some
The
tools that you
right.
use more than others. Yeah.
Distortions Always. Something to be very careful about.
Yes.
Thank you, Indermit. That was an exciting chat. Thank you very much for joining me.
It's a pleasure.
And for those of you who are interested in hearing more about South Asia's prospects, please have a look at our latest edition of the South Asia Economic Update. Thank you.